I suppose that you expect me to believe in sorcery as well.
Of course.
Why?
Because it's real.
How can I know that, Mr. Shen?
See? That was nothing. But that's how it always begins. Very small.
Is that how these impressive structures that we've explored across the land really began? As some very small structure? Indeed, all these very small blocks had to be carved, weren't they? Or were they formed with some advanced process of alchemy that's beyond our current understanding? This is one of the theories that we've worked with in our explorations, and here in Lexington, Kentucky, we see that there are elaborate constructions that seem to defy the logistical and construction limitations at the time. But what's the real explanation? How do we explain these processes, and what were these sciences, these occult sciences as we call them now? And what exactly is the occult? Join me as we explore these interesting questions, seeking answers for the how behind all these incredible and impressive structures that we've looked at. Join me as we explore the occult sciences and the old world. What do we define as the occult sciences? Alchemy, astrology, magic. What exactly are occult sciences? We tend to define occult sciences as that doesn't fall under the current institutionalized recognition of our sciences or any of our other recognized studies. And yet, oddly enough, occult science includes many different fields, and we're going to explore those fields in this particular exploration. Is it possible that really what these occult sciences are the remnants of the original Old World technology, or at least the knowledge of it? The Old World technology that was utilized to construct these impressive structures that still dwell across the land, defying explanation with their longevity and the enduring nature of their construction. Of course, mainstream sources will tell us that they simply had better efforts that were put into their construction, that everyone was a craftsman, and there's really no explanation given for the logistical feats of the past. Just assume that they did it, because obviously somebody did it, and we're not denying that. But what exactly is the origin behind these occult sciences? We think of things that are mysterious, that defy explanation. And whether we're talking about magic, alchemy, astrology, or even yoga, which, believe it or not, is considered an occult science, we're actually looking for what the explanations are for how we managed to build this civilization in the past. Are we to take the mainstream account seriously that in the 1800s, with just horse and buggy and various people possessing incredible knowledge, whether it was construction knowledge or craftsmanship knowledge, and of course nothing ever mentioned about logistical knowledge, that they managed to construct these impressive edifices that still stand to this day? Or did they have some sort of more advanced knowledge that still survives today in what we call the occult sciences? And why is this labeled as the occult sciences? Interestingly enough, when we look at the mainstream perception of the occult sciences, it varies. It's all over the spectrum in terms of seriousness. Some of these things are not taken very serious at all, and yet others have an element of seriousness to them, such as examining the historical account of the very polarizing figure Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was active in the early 20th century and the late 19th century, or the late 1800s, early 1900s. A very questionable time to be sure, and you can certainly research Mr. Crowley's biography on your own. There have been many others who have retained knowledge of occult sciences, although how accurate are they? Why is there such a reference to the very unique and intricate symbolism within the occult sciences? Do they have meaning? Are there direct connections to the old world? Now, there's many different interpretations of what the occult really is, and the occult sciences. But one thing I encourage you to do is certainly research on your own and come to your own conclusions, because, as always, this is a very conflicting account. Indeed, looking into the background of Aleister Crowley, some people will say that he's one of the most evil individuals in the land in the early 1900s. Of course, he would subsequently be surpassed by the era of the dictators, as we call them. But what was really the truth behind Aleister Crowley? Was he merely just some elaborate, extravagant individual who dressed up in unique garb and paid tribute to certain long-lost religions or belief systems that we no longer have knowledge of? Or did he actually have access to knowledge that was lost? What about Madame Blavatsky and her understanding of creating her own religion? What's really the origin behind these individuals, and why were there so many people like this in the 1800s? Well, we can certainly say there were plenty of people like this in the 1900s too, such as Elizabeth Clare Prophet, but why is there something almost more enduring about their presence in the 1800s and the early 1900s? Indeed, you can find what tends to reflect the membership of some sort of occult sciences. It involves dressing up in some elaborate form of garb or raiment. But what's it really mean? Is there symbolism behind it, or is it an actual reflection of what occurred in the past? And what are the meanings behind these accessories? Do they actually have a use and an application? Or is it all just for ceremony? It's hard to say. It is informed to us that Crowley had studied many individuals that came before him, many of his predecessors with rather interesting looks and interesting personal habits. Of course, that's going off the mainstream official historical account, and to what extent that we could actually trust that. Maybe it is 100% accurate. Crowley had a very interesting life, even trying to scale great mountains in failed expeditions, where the members of the expedition apparently even tried to replace him as leader of the expedition. Make of these accounts what you will, but why is it during this time frame in this so-called age of exploration or age of discovery and heroes, people are always trying to go to elaborate places? And what to make of Crowley himself? We have accounts that he may have even played a role in setting up World War I by encouraging the German attack on the Lusitania. Is that really what happened? Is foreign policy really that easy to shape that a person who's undercover could very easily suggest something that a nation would act on? Well, if that's indeed the case, then why do we even have wars at all? Going beyond the potential events of Aleister Crowley, whose life is quite questionable in and of itself, we look at some of the deeper meanings, though, behind the studies of the occult. It's mysterious, it's alluring. But is it really serious, or is it something that's supposed to be taken with a grain of salt? Or are we to treat it in a manner that is not very serious? And I certainly don't want to disrespect anyone's beliefs, because I'm all about respecting all beliefs, even if they're not necessarily the beliefs that I was initially ingrained with. Because it really doesn't matter. Maybe all of these beliefs have application to them, that there are serious elements, especially within the occult. It could be possible that an individual such as Aleister Crowley really did have connections, and really did have some sort of esoteric knowledge, and that the reason that we're informed that he was evil and bent is because perhaps there was another meaning behind what he was doing. Or maybe he was resisting the authorities of the day. Truth of the matter is, do your own studies on his biography and come to your own conclusions. And maybe there is reality to the fact that he was perhaps a very evil and twisted man. Or maybe he really was just simply an intelligence agent. Who knows for sure? We do know, though, that there are a lot of connections, and there were a lot of other groups that he was affiliated with, such as the odd Oriental Templar Order. Yes, apparently some sort of Germanic order that had other connections and other esoteric connections. And that's the odd thing about this. Looking behind all these potential memberships and all these organizations that existed and overlapped in the 1800s. And you may recall that we've looked at all these rather unique groups in the past. This symbolism that traces its origin all the way back to ancient Egypt, apparently. Or is it ancient Egypt, or is it some other connection? What's really the meaning behind the Golden Dawn, and what is the actual Tree of Life? There's several different interpretations of it, and you can certainly look at the reference material itself and come to your own conclusions. But I have to ask the question, is there an entirely different meaning behind this unique and esoteric knowledge? Crowley never actually met Nikola Tesla, although that's quite surprising given the fact that Tesla seems to be connected with everything and anything that came into being in the early 1900s, whether it was technology or various applications of technology. But officially they never met, but oddly enough there are many strange connections. And is there a connection with the esoteric loss of martial arts knowledge? We think of the story of Frank Dukes, the individual who's responsible for writing the story of Bloodsport, and of course the actual reality of the events that he relayed. And he dressed up in fancy costumes too, so perhaps he had some sort of esoteric knowledge. But there is actual scientific application to martial arts. There's no questioning that. And the fact that force equals mass times velocity squared. It's a simple formula. If you can strike faster, you can apply more force. And of course, if you have more mass, you can apply more force. But what's all this getting at? It's looking at what may well be lost actual scientific knowledge. Take the example of astrology, the study of the celestial objects and their position in the sky. Now, of course, the official study of astrology is stated to have preceded the current and scientific accepted study of astronomy. And of course, our favorite channel scientific contributor, Carl Sagan, states that astrology is simply a silly study that's very easily derided and denied. And he goes out of his way in the Cosmos series to make sure that he tells us exactly what he thinks of astrology. And we have to appreciate the fact that he's very honest about it. But is there something more behind the study of astrology and the symbolism behind it? The various signs, do they have a different meaning? Perhaps there's no actual alignment with any sort of celestial objects. Maybe they're merely signs that provide a different sort of calendar, a different sort of understanding of a sequence of events that may be beyond us. Perhaps it's another way of tracking a long count calendar, and indeed, there are different cultures and civilizations that do employ astrology in that manner. And as I'm fond of saying, you simply have to come to your own conclusions. Because some people will tell you that this is merely pseudoscience, that it's very easily dismissed, that there's nothing behind astrology aside from a means of occupying your time. Are you a Virgo? Are you a Sagittarius? Are you a Pisces? What are the differences? When you were born, does it have an effect on who you are and what your fate is going to be? Or is there something else behind it entirely? Let us suppose that the actual study of astrology really had a much more serious component to it, that the symbols and the outcomes that were associated with them and the arrangement of these symbols had a completely different meaning. Indeed, perhaps it reflected a much more accurate calendar than we can begin to imagine, a calendar that was truly accurate and did really keep track of time. And not only time, but it also operates in cycles, because we have to consider the fact that our actual civilization, our society, and our reality that we're in does operate in some sort of cycles. There's also the presence of astrology symbols in many of the structures that we've looked at. Why so many astrology symbols in all of these structures? And many of these structures were constructed, of course, in that questionable time frame between 1880 and 1930, when we seem to be able to pull off amazing things. So why, again, do we see this reference to astrology? Was there some sort of meaning? Did this actually have a much more powerful place in our civilization in the past? Well, if you go off the mainstream account, it just apparently looked like it was a cool thing to decorate structures with in that questionable period from the late 1800s to the 1930s. Even in locations undisclosed, we see the great zodiac that shows us the symbols of astrology. So why do you see it everywhere? Well, perhaps it's just similar to that explanation for why when you just look at random buildings in random places, whether it's in New York City or, dare I even say, Lexington, Kentucky, where you'll just happen to see griffins all over the place. And the zodiac is much like the griffin. It's just coming up everywhere. But what does it really mean? If these structures really were constructed by a previous civilization, then apparently the zodiac had a very paramount importance, much in the same way that the griffin did. But why does it also come up in things such as the Prague clock? It again gives the impression that there was a very paramount significance behind it, that someone was really trying to establish counts and cycles. Were they preparing for some impending disaster? Or did they simply understand that there was going to be a new age, if you will? People often talk about the difference between the age of Aquarius and the age of Pisces and how we've transitioned these ages and how things are no longer emotionally based. And we need to approach things with a more stoic outlook, albeit pessimistic either way, apparently, according to some. But whatever your outlook on life, consider the fact that all of these structures that we've looked at have no shortage of the symbols that do reflect the astrological symbols that we've studied. And it seems to indicate that it was a very paramount and important study in the past. Was it really what their entire civilization was based on? Or did it provide them unique opportunities if they understood the cycles? Were they aware of the fact that there were changing ages? Did they understand the difference between the eras? Or were they simply as directionless as we are about it, operating on a calendar that's not entirely accurate? And maybe it's just all a great coincidence. For whatever reason, though, you have to understand, and I ask you to pay attention when you're doing your own explorations or just simply anywhere out and about. How many references do you see to astrological symbols? And what do they really mean? Do they mean what they tell us they mean? Or do they have a greater significance behind them? Do they reflect perhaps an opportunity as one transitions cycles, eras or ages, or whatever you want to call great periods of time? And oddly enough, we have to try to decipher these symbols. What makes us more challenging, though, is it's clear that in our current civilization, we do assign different meanings to symbols. And what about the art of divination or magic, the ability to conjure things? Now, of course, this is where the occult sciences starts to cross the line from what people would consider serious science to something that they might not even consider pseudoscience, but simply the realm of one's imagination or fantasy. It may be true, but there are many people who practice and have knowledge of divination or magic, the ability to conjure things from knowledge of certain spells, incantations, or other esoteric or insider knowledge that is lost to our current civilization. Was it possible that in the past this was really not just simply magic, but actually a form of more advanced technology? An ability to actually form things using applications of this technology. Imagine if to us it appears as magic, but in reality it is an actual certified technology, the knowledge of which has simply been lost over time. And now to ensure that others do not use this technology that could, how shall we say, threaten the current status quo, that it's merely taken in a non-serious manner, and it's even ridiculed by members of the mainstream. Now, I don't recall Carl Sagan going out of his way to ridicule divination in Cosmos, but he did seem to make a few references to it. Or watch a series and come to your own conclusions. But there are many different references from different cultures, different times, different societies that divination and magic and the presence of it really did have a practical application. And if it was all just in the minds of individuals, then why does this endure to this day? Well, the answer will be because people are gullible and they simply want to believe certain things. Yet we're supposed to believe that these, again, same people in the past who were so gullible were able to build these very impressive structures according to the mainstream account? And maybe they did. Maybe they really did figure it out. Or perhaps there's a much more elaborate explanation behind it. We're often told that Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, tends to be the most correct explanation. However, much like they say with every sword, there's two blades that cut both ways. Oftentimes, seeking the simplest explanation will have you overlook what may be the accurate explanation. And that happens just as often as the simplest explanation being the outcome. In the end, I don't know what the past really contained. I don't know if we once had the ability to practice alchemy, divination, or astrology. But if we did, and if they all worked together as more advanced sciences, could it provide an explanation for how the great structures that we've explored, whether it's a courthouse in Lexington, Kentucky, a state capitol in Iowa, an impressive cathedral anywhere in the Czech Republic, is it possible that the real construction knowledge of this came from what today we consider the occult sciences? And just imagine what the possibilities would be if this is the actual explanation. If this is how we explain all these logistical conundrums that we have when we consider the questions on how these structures were really completed. If there was the ability to conjure or perhaps create some sort of advanced polymer or even a construction material that's beyond our ability to categorize and describe, perhaps it was through the process of alchemy, magic, divination, at least what we would call those terms, that this construction material was actually innovated. And perhaps there were other means for transporting it. And it doesn't matter whether you look at the legacy of Asia, Europe, South America, North America, or anywhere else in the land, you will find numerous accounts to this actually being an applied science in the past. Now, of course, we're simply informed that it was merely myth, it is legend, there is no real divination. And yet people actually practice it. And the reference of Egshan from the film Big Trouble in Little China shows that there were people who practiced and believed in it. Well, it's just a movie, it's not real. Of course. Of course you can say that about anything and everything. Going back to the 1800s in that questionable Victorian time frame, they even consider the study of what we officially call ghosts as part of the occult sciences. Now we have to ask this question. Is this a legitimate study of the occult sciences? Or is this just something that's categorized with them in order to potentially discredit the actual occult sciences? It is stated that projection technology was available during the Victorian time frame, and it was utilized in theatrical performances to provide the imaging of specters on the stage. Now, is that what really happened, or was there a more advanced application to it? Or is it possible that they really had the ability to capture something from a different realm or a different reality? There are many different explanations. The mainstream official historical explanation, of course, is yes, they innovated projection technology and thus began with the theatricality and, I don't want to say deception, but perhaps presentation, all in the form of entertainment. There's no shortage, though, of photos that are available from the 1800s that give us the impression that there was some sort of connection with the spiritual realm. Once again, the easy response to this is that these were merely altered photos. And indeed, since photography was a relatively new medium at the time, then you had the ability to alter photos and therefore make it appear as though there was some sort of spirit that was actually present in these photos. Now, I was not present when these photos were taken, and I certainly was not present when these photos were developed. So whether they were altered or not, I cannot say for sure. You can certainly come to your own conclusions, and it may well be that they were altered, every single one of them. Or is there a different explanation behind it? Is it possible that there was a completely different type of technology that was still available? Whether we consider it spiritual mediums or some other form of speaking and interfacing with different realms. It certainly opens up the possibility for many different forms of existence. And perhaps in this current civilization, people just simply want to deny or deprive themselves of considering the possibility. Because we've explained everything. We know the answers to everything. At least that's what we'll be informed that mainstream science provides for us. And if we don't know the answers yet, well, we're very close to discovering them. And once again, I do admit that may be true. But if that's true, then why do we have so many enduring mysteries? And why is it people have to struggle and commit to cheetah flips and intellectual leaps of logic to try to explain all these mysteries that we've had? Why is it so wrong to have something that's mysterious? Isn't that the very basis of exploration? Is it possible that some of these specters in these images may have something more real behind them? And what's wrong with even considering that possibility? Well, you have to be ridiculed. There's no such thing as ghosts, and that may indeed be true. But is it possible that there could be other life forms that operate on a completely different dimensional plane than the dimensional plane that we operate on? And could this be a legitimate explanation for these specters that we see and we classify as ghosts? This all may be possible. There's other images of rather unique technological developments that came from the Victorian era. And someone who told me in the comments on one of our explorations last week, in terms of how we would explain the presence of, say, something as a radiator, and yet nobody really knows how a radiator works. I mean, we have an understanding of it. Or even an older form of copying technology, such as the ditto machine. We lose knowledge very quickly, and it's a very good point. Because, of course, the technology is obsolete, so who's going to practice it anymore? And maybe that's the explanation. But it's also another reference for why and how we have so many explanations of not understanding what the reality behind things are. When you look at this particular image, you can see that there may be something much more to it. Is it possible that this is just a natural rock formation on this land? Or is there something more to it? What about the bridge? What about all these images where we have these spectral figures? Again, they could just all be altered photographs, every single one of them. But let's suppose that they are all altered photographs. Then we have a much more disturbing question. If photographs from the 1800s could be very easily altered and were, especially in this quantity, then how many of the total photographs that we have that we rely on to give us our mainstream historical evidence may have been altered? The truth of the matter is we don't know. We have no way of knowing. Now, people will say that it's merely a presumption on our part. But what's the truth and what's the reality? It's ultimately up to you. There's also the continued mystery of objects in the sky, or what we call UFOs, and now the more recent term UAPs, unidentified flying objects, and now unidentified aerial phenomenon. When did it really start? Or would you be surprised to know that there were a slew of unidentified flying objects, or mystery airships as they call them, from the 1890s to, again, the early 1900s. And this is also considered part of the occult sciences, ufology, although oddly enough the study of UFOs tends to go back and forth, whether it's taken seriously. Indeed, there have been several official military studies trying to document these unidentified flying objects, such as Project Blue Book, or unidentified aerial phenomenon, and yet the conclusion is always the same. There's never really anything actually going on. There may be a few objects that we do decide we can't determine the identity of. And it may well be that these are just, again, simply doctored or changed images once again, or images that are images of something else entirely. Maybe they're just simply some sort of strange ability to develop the photo and make it appear as though there's something in it that's not really there. Again, some sort of lost ability. But oddly enough, there are numerous newspaper articles that we refer to from the 1890s that do indicate there seemed to be some sort of strange technology available with these mystery airships. And indeed, there are actual photos that are certified as official that show airships flying all over the place in the very early 1900s and even the late 1890s. So what to make of it? It's very hard to say, because as we've stated before, there are no first-hand accounts that we can gain from 1899. Indeed, one of the oldest people in the world recently passed away, and they were around in 1908, but they didn't have conscious memory in 1908. So again, as we try to look at the past and corroborate what actually happened, the availability of first-hand accounts decreases with the passage of time. But you don't need to worry yourself about that, because we have historians, we have scholars, we have scientists, and they will study things with the passage of time, and they will come to conclusions that will be transmitted to us, and these are the official conclusions that we will abide by. And you certainly have the discretion to do that and accept these conclusions. But it shouldn't be wrong to ask questions about them. It shouldn't be wrong to be able to explore and consider alternative possibilities. Why is it so important to dictate exactly what people think? If I'm just thinking something, it's certainly no danger to anybody else, is it? What's really the story behind these strange aerial objects? Is it all really just mass pandemonium? Merely the elaborate fabrications of people who are derided as conspiracy theorists? Is it merely strange clouds in the sky, Venus, or odd aerial phenomenon that we just don't understand? Or could it be something else entirely? Signs of some sort of overlapping of realities, or even possibly the remains of portals? We'll be informed by the mainstream that the study of UFOs should be undertaken, but it should be undertaken by official government agencies, and it should, of course, remove all conspiracy theorists. Or in other words, it should remove the conclusions of anybody thinking for themselves, because that's not something we encourage, and we should trust the official accounts. Whatever you make of the entire study of UFOs, and I'm always fascinated how I've never really mentioned UFOs in any official exploration, but yet for some reason people always just bring them up in the comments, which is quite fascinating to me. I guess we just try to attribute everything to the occult sciences. Which is fascinating because it goes down to that whole concept of what's being taken seriously and what's simply to be taken with total absurdity. Why are we mixing the serious with the absurd? It's almost as though someone seems to be intentionally trying to cloud the picture of what really happened. Or in other words, you always have the ability to say that this isn't serious. We didn't actually have this technology with these balloons, these blimps, these rigid airships in the past. Well, we did, but it was very controlled. My best friend's brother's sister's boyfriend's cousin's girlfriend saw a blimp and could tell you exactly what its capabilities were. And that may be true. If I had 10 cents for every time somebody commented on that. The point being is that first-hand accounts are very limited. And you might be surprised to know that this technology we've had for quite some time. Whether it's a blimp, an airship, or even the drone. Yes, we've had drone technology since the end of World War I. But you talk to some people and they would think it's a recent technological innovation from the 2000s. Perhaps there was a different change in application, but the technology was always there. So back to the original question, what are we actually seeing in the sky? Is there anything going on, or is it just simply misinformation? Something that's encouraged to keep us looking at certain things, or perhaps to provide a potential explanation for something that's really going on, but yet has no legitimate explanation for it. As always, I'll let you come to your own conclusions, and by all means, let me know what you think in the comments about all this, such as UFOs. But we look at some of these other images, though, and I remember when I first saw them, and I always thought it was interesting how these almost look like models. These look like plates. Are they? Some of the images do. Some of the images may have more veracity to them. But again, it's just a picture. Unless you're actually there witnessing the event when it happened, you don't really have any way to know exactly what really happened. There's something to be said for having a first-hand account of something and witnessing yourself and seeing it with your own eyes. It truly gives a degree of realism. What was the story of saucers over Washington, D.C., and where did saucers come from? Well, we go back to pre-World War II times with the film Things to Come, which was overseen, produced, and written by H.G. Wells. Ah yes, H.G. Wells, the individual who wrote War of the Worlds, who developed a very interesting sense of world affairs, especially in the 1930s. H.G. Wells was quite despondent with the film Metropolis, and he felt that Things to Come was a response to this. And here we have protagonist John Cabal, and no, I'm not making this up, in his really cool black uniform with his really nice black boots, standing over the pacified population of Everytown, after his organization Wings Over the World has bombed it with the gas of peace. Fortunately, the gas of peace didn't kill anybody. Well, actually, it did kill the chief, who was the warlord who was in charge of Everytown. And John Cabal states that Wings Over the World has a problem with sovereign nations. They do not accept sovereign nations. And you might notice that a lot of the old world architecture is shown being destroyed in these images. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. And unfortunately for the chief, because he had a condition the gas of peace didn't render him unconscious, it killed him. But it was fortuitous in the plot that it didn't kill anyone else who was innocent and had some sort of condition that would have rendered them vulnerable to the gas of peace, causing death. Yes, a very, very odd protagonist with a very strange name and a very odd organization, Wings Over the World, but that was the story. And Jack Palance even gave a turn in the Shape of Things to Come that was released in Canada in the late 1970s. I will say he looks slightly more dignified in his particular helmet than the John Cabal of the 1930s version did, but that's just my opinion. Make of it what you will. What's all this have to do with the occult sciences, though? Well, we see that there's always this intention to induce some sort of form of absurdity in it. And even the study of Bigfoot and cryptids is actually considered an occult science. Yes, very, very odd. What's the reality behind Bigfoot? Because that's considered an occult science. Is it an actual study of a possible cryptid? Is cryptozoology or animals that we haven't identified or cataloged yet possible? Or is it merely just something designed to divert our attention? Well, there's evidence that indicates both ways, and evidence that seems to be legitimate first-hand accounts of people who have encountered creatures such as these that we can't explain. And then, of course, there's the fact that science says we've never actually captured one of these creatures alive, and there's no evidence of this happening to show that we have definitive conclusions. Although really we could say the same thing about any of the other occult sciences. And so, what's really the story behind Bigfoot? I honestly don't know. It may well be that it's a legitimate cryptid. It may be that it's some sort of life form that again exists between realities that can only be encountered in certain areas. Or it may really simply be the product of our imagination. I'm not taking that off the table, and at no point in time do I. I leave it to you to decide. But it is interesting how the legacy of this mystery continues, how it continues to endure, much as the UFO mystery and these other mysteries. Of course, there are no mysteries. But yet the mainstream then wants to say, yes, we need to study these mysteries, but without the interference of conspiracy theorists. So it's as though they want to have it both ways. Last but not least, would you believe that yoga is actually considered an occult science? Yes, yoga, something that you go down and do at your local YMCA if you're in the United States, or any fitness club, and something that you can achieve a certification for. Isn't that interesting? Yes, you can be certified for yoga, an occult science, and you can teach your own yoga class. I'd like you to stay with me as we examine the concept of the occult sciences and look more closely at alchemy, and even the accounts of the homunculus, or the many pronunciations for it. There's many interesting elements to occult sciences that could explain these incredible old world structures we've looked at. Yes, and the study of alchemy is one of those difficulties for the mainstream because they have to address its existence because it is in all the quote-unquote well-documented accounts of all the main civilizations that we have. Everybody has an account in a history of alchemy. And what you're looking at here is one of the main pictures that people think of alchemy, but let's dive into it and see what we really have. So this is a little summarized one-pager on alchemy knowledge, and this was actually something I recall being shown in the classes, so let me just make sure you can all see this really well. Absolutely right. It is both. It's everything. It's internal, it's external, the alchemical trinity, and we'll talk about what the main purpose or function of alchemy was. What was the end-all be-all of alchemy? Because basically every philosophy has its end-all be-all. Well, alchemy did too. Of course, we could say that current science has its end-all be-all, and that is do as I say and don't think for yourself, right? So in any event, looking at the baseline of alchemical knowledge, though, you have the 7 states of alchemical transformation. You have calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, coagulation. Now, I know I'm going through this a bit fast, but these are the steps that involves the transformation of material, which is supposed to be one of the baseline aspects of alchemy, that you can turn any baseline material into the greatest materials, or in the simple comparison they tend to use, mercury into gold, or stones into gold, or whatever. You also have the Pythagorean cosmic morphology, so this is more the spiritual aspect of it. The original 4 elements, earth, fire, air, and water, and then here they have Gaia as well. And then the different shapes. There's a lot of different aspects to alchemy. There's also the alchemical symbols, Hermes the alchemist, and there's many different symbols. The study of symbology, not to be confused with symbolism. What is the symbolism of it? Okay, I'll stop. I know somebody's out there getting a laugh out of it, but they have many different esoteric symbols, and it's also another game on words because is it exoteric or exoteric? In other words, known and demonstrated to the masses, or esoteric with an S, known only by a few. A lot of the real study of alchemy is an interesting contradiction because it tends to include both. We have both aspects. We have things that are well known, but yet there's what everybody thinks of alchemy. Well, it's basically magic from the Middle Ages, and it was pretty crazy, and that's why people gave it up. Would you be surprised to know, though, that alchemy is also acknowledged by current science and historians as being the forerunner of current science, current medical practices, current chemistry? Were any of you aware of that? Yeah, space of knowledge. Very true. And Da Vinci, supposedly. There were many great leaders in alchemy back in the day. That's a good way to put it. Everything is alchemical. Absolutely. And who did I miss there? Well, thanks. I really appreciate that. Yeah, the potions class. And you can really pull it back to that baseline mentality. Now, the other question I'm going to ask you is, when did alchemy start? A lot of people think that it started in the Middle Ages or the medieval period. Would you be surprised to know, though, that official history states that it started back around 300 to 400 CE, AD, whatever date system you want to go with. Yeah, Mix this, get that with the gold. That's right. And you can see it on this sheet here in terms of how it's all supposed to work. Now, granted, this is just a very broad stroke brush in terms of how academia or the current academic institution regards alchemy. Now, you're probably not too surprised to know that there are many different authors, there's many different schools of thought, and many different theories within the mainstream itself about the origin of alchemy. But what we can say is that it did start during that very bizarre time frame with the library in Alexandria. And we see some of the symbols of alchemy, and they do look rather familiar to us, and we do actually see them, including in many of the building explorations that we do. And why is that, do you think? Why do you think we see this in so many different places as we define alchemy? Oh, yeah. And forbidden divine knowledge provided by angels, is it some sort of scientific thought? Did it precede all religion? Or is it merely a broken apart aspect of the civilization that we had before, one of their fundamental belief systems that was separated from religion? Because isn't it interesting that according to the mainstream account, alchemy exists in all the major religions, or at least the areas that they were known to operate in? You know, and here you have all these different symbols and aspects to alchemy, and there are a lot of symbols in alchemy. We're not even beginning to scratch the surface with them. But what does it really represent? Well, we can do a full study on symbols and everything behind it, but it all comes down to two aspects within alchemy. And really, it's the quest for achieving one thing, and we'll get to that in a moment. I'm sure those of you who are familiar with alchemy already know what it is. But the imagery and the iconography with it really communicates a lot of different things. You always have the king and the queen. You always have the sun and the moon. Those are some baselines. And of course, we'll get to the almighty Ouroboros, or the beginning and ending of everything. So what are your thoughts on this layout of alchemy so far? Ah, yes. I'm glad you brought that up, Sky Sage, because it's very interesting that the study of Gnosticism is something that certain alternative researchers seem to go out of their way to deride for whatever reason. They think it's something that needs to be purged from the entire truther community or the alternative research community. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with me, but I don't like operating in large collectivizations. I don't believe in it. I believe everybody should do their own research, come to their own conclusions. That's how I prefer to operate. Look at that. Yep, Jamie's on it. The quest for the Philosopher's Stone, and that's the real end-all be-all of alchemy. But for whatever reason, certain truthers don't like to talk about, and I don't like using terms like that, but we'll just say certain alternative researchers do not like to talk about Gnosticism. And by virtue of connection to that, they don't like to talk about alchemy, and they want it stricken from all discussion. They believe it's a plague or a stigma on this kind of alternative research. And so be it. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, including other alternative researchers. But I think it's interesting, though, that alchemy provides so many powerful explanations. And you know what, KFD? I think that sums it up right there. Alchemy is universal knowledge. I believe it's universal knowledge, and I believe it's something that we have that comes all the way back from the oldest elements of our civilization, perhaps originating in the first era, which I'm not allowed to, and I'm certainly not encouraged to talk about. But we know it exists, right? We know it exists. So moving on, we have other different imagery or other different images of alchemy. We think of it as this process of where you have all these different connected scientific devices and all these measuring devices and lots of hoses, and it all connects to a central apparatus, and you're able to make some sort of concoction. And there are a lot of elements to that that's truth. And in fact, if you go back and watch my favorite series, I'm being facetious, of course, but Cosmos with Carl Sagan, when they have that little apparatus that they construct that creates the building blocks of life, it looks something like this. Coincidence? And then, of course, you have the main laboratory or laboratory if you're speaking British English. And, of course, you know how I like to poke fun at pronunciations and dialects because there's over 160 for English or many, many more. But this is what we tend to have in mind when we think of alchemists, these kind of images. And then there's also a lot of symbolic writing to this. And, of course, when you look at this, it almost looks like we're looking at the Voynich manuscript or something with a lot of different incantations, various devices that could be telling us how to do different things, how to mix and make different things, how to match different things. We also have different types of symbols that we talked about earlier. And again, this is not even close to all the symbols. There's hundreds, thousands of different symbols in coded talk. Now, why do you think they had all this coded talk? What did this all come down from? Yeah, it comes up a lot, doesn't it? Yeah, there's a steampunk vibe to alchemical devices, without any shadow of a doubt. Alcohol is alchemy. That's a good one, Rebecca. Yeah, in a manner of speaking, it is mixing and matching. And, why do we have all those breweries that are in the old world castle buildings? Yeah, you're right, Robert. A lot of them are occult symbols. A lot of them are used by many of the quote unquote secret societies, although when everybody knows about them, I don't know why we call them secret societies. So, there he is. When you're going to show up. Good to see you. So, going over some of the symbolism and the symbology, because we've got both in alchemy. Now, here's a little bit more of a comprehensive view of the symbols so you can see what some of the rest of them look like. And you may notice that we have come across a lot of these symbols when we've done our initial explorations, whether it's in buildings, whether it's in looking at old documents or texts. You'll see these symbols come up everywhere. Now, you may be surprised to know, though, that in one of our on-site explorations that we've done on the channel, we've actually been in a building that I believe is very strongly affiliated with alchemy, or at least the studies of alchemy that went to, how shall we say, the dark side. Now, wait a minute, what are you talking about, the Force or something here? Well, there is always a light and a dark side to everything, and everything exists in balance. There are aspects of alchemy that have a lot of positive connotations to them, and there's also a lot of negative connotations to alchemy, and we're going to be exploring that as well. No, I'm not shirking away from anything in this exploration. Yeah. Taurus the bull sign, that's a good one. And a lot of it is secret teachings. Absolutely right. Or was it originally secret, or was it something that had to be secret? Was it something that was suppressed? In other words, the powers that be tried to eliminate it. So, in any event, good to see you, Stephen. Good to see you. Yeah, don't we? 100% fusion match, yes. Where's cold fusion? Didn't they promise that quite a long time ago? That sounded like something that was alchemy. No doubt about it. And you're right, the symbols do change, just like the language and the dialects change, so. There is a lot of potential in it, Corky. You're right. And that's something that we include in the definition, especially when we talk about what the final goal of alchemy really is. And here you have it with some of the more common alchemical symbols. And what is the grand exploration of alchemy all about? Well, it comes down to this. They're seeking the Philosopher's Stone, the magnum opus, or the great work. So in other words, all these alchemists, whether they were from 300 AD or ACE, or however the heck you want to say it, it doesn't really matter. Our entire recorded history from basically right after the collapse of the Roman Empire, according to official history, up until the late 1800s, what they were seeking was the Philosopher's Stone. Alchemists were seeking the Philosopher's Stone. That was the great work. In other words, it was a special material that could transmute any other material into gold. And then even more importantly, it was considered the elixir of life. In other words, it would allow you to live forever. Now, does that mean your physical body, or does that mean something else? Oh, look at that, Rebecca. I mean, did you just see the answers to the tests? Bingo. Absolutely right. And there are accounts that several did accomplish the Philosopher's Stone, Elvin, and we'll take a look at that. Yes, many of the alchemists searched for the Philosopher's Stone, and there are accounts that there are some that actually found it. But really what it comes down to, as Jamie says, it's anything into anything, and it promises life eternal, which is something that people who fear death are always looking for. Exactly. It's universal knowledge, but what changes is the changing outlook. Oh, that's true. And that's also true with the knowledge base. And that's why I would make the argument, my theory is that alchemy is a base of knowledge. But there's a little bit more to it, because it's also seen as an internal spiritual quest. And when you look at the origin of it, and a lot of the original documents of alchemy were lost over time, it was also internal as well. So it goes back to what Rebecca was saying. Humans forgot that they already had immortal life. And yet this is what they're promising people. Yes. Now, there's a lot of discussions about what a soul is, and we're not going to go down that road today. We'll get to that in subsequent explorations, but we're seeing what alchemy promised and what it really could have been. So it led to many different things. It seemed to be a base of knowledge that came from the very old world that gave people the ability to do many different things, transmute materials, heal anything. And when we talk about the difference between, and I'm going to go on dangerous ground here, but the current medicine practices that we have, they're supposedly derived from original alchemy. So, in any event, those are all things to keep in mind with it. And here is the baseline symbol of alchemy, the Ouroboros. And does everybody know what the Ouroboros means? The snake eating itself. The beginning and the end. A cycle. Yeah, or was it derived from AIT Fetch? That's a good point. And why is that? Why do we have that amnesia? Is it because we simply go down all these rabbit holes and we forget what we already know? And then we stop trusting ourselves, and then we trust deception because we don't trust ourselves. And that's another good way to put it, as above, so below. And so that's why it really comes down to the search for the Philosopher's Stone. The original philosophy of alchemy was that it was a search for within. In other words, look inside yourself. Find the spiritual strength within yourself, and then the rest of these great abilities of alchemy, or what the original philosophy suggested, or the base of knowledge, was that then you could achieve all these great things. You could achieve a material that could transmute to other materials. You could achieve the ability to actually control the course of life itself. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen that one. Oh, Conan. Yes. What is great in life? But that's the real baseline for it. You know, it was supposed to be a quest for oneself. And then as you look at how the mainstream says it evolved or de-evolved, however you want to look at it, by the Middle Ages or the medieval time frame, 13 to 1600s, then it'd simply become a quest for A, immortality, and then B, riches, because if you could transmute any material into gold, you'd be rich. Of course, we have our current science where they say that using atomic processes, they could create gold as early as the 1940s, but they just don't bother to do so because it's not cost effective. Yeah, isn't it funny that they talk about that? Well, and you know what? I'm glad you brought that up, Stephen, because that's how those all relate together. But what's the real quest? Is it a quest for internal salvation, or is it a quest for external and physical pleasures? And that's always the debate. Yeah, pretty much. The original nanolade, yeah? And that's probably where a lot of those inspirations came from, Jamie. You're right. And I think it does include everything. And please make sure you hit that like button, and I appreciate everybody joining. And by all means, keep contributing your opinions, because this is an open study. Now, there's also the concept of existence and shapes and dimensions. Those are examined in alchemy, and that's been lost over the course of time. And as you go further back, you can actually find more of the references to it, which is quite intriguing. Now, this is one of the baseline images that you'll see that represents alchemy, the symbolism, a couple birds, and then, of course, the Ouroboros, although the snake or the dragon or whatever you want to say it is actually on its back. And yet, when we look at other images of alchemy, we can see that it gets a lot more complex. There's many more ideologies that broker into it. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating about looking at the symbolism in the account of alchemy is how much it looks like our old friends in the Voynich manuscript. Oh, yeah. It's all in there, Adam. I mean, you'll see every symbol you can imagine within alchemy. So, yeah. And, you know, it's funny you referenced that one, Rebecca, because the quest for the Holy Grail was just that. It's a bunch of fools that are looking physically for something. Whereas if you watch the film Excalibur, it's accurately depicted as finding out what you already knew. Arthur had to be reminded of what he already knew, that he and the land were one. At least that's how the story comes across. So again, searching internally, not externally. Well, and are we told the truth, or do we have to seek the truth internally? I mean, that's the great question that we're always facing. Aha. And that was actually the very summation right there, Robert, the very baseline belief of what alchemy was really all about. You were doing an internal search. You were finding your own answers. You were determining your purpose in life. And that's what it was all about. You were finding your own purpose. And there's a lot of romanticized images, and I use that word very directly, from the medieval time frame, because this is what people were obsessed with. And you saw people in all these very elaborate outfits during the time when there were famines, wars, disease, and yet there were these magicians called alchemists who could just suddenly produce you gold out of everything. And then they would give you the elixir of light. Remember Saint Germain? Remember that episode of In Search of? Yeah, it all comes from that as well. And then some of the other symbols where they started to incorporate it with more of a spiritual quest, if you will. And so what you're finding as you look more into alchemy is that it gets more confused and more, how shall we say, derided over time. And it becomes a derivative, much like we see in all of our remakes that we have now. Good one, Merlin the Wizard. Probably an actual original alchemist. And if you look at the role that Merlin plays in the original Arthurian legends and even the film, of course, I'm only talking about Excalibur, then you see that Merlin is very much one of the senior alchemists, which is quite intriguing about it. Yes, indeed. And it's not an easy topic to talk about. And it's not exactly something that people want to really think about. They want to embrace the concept of alchemy that was pushed in the Middle Ages or the medieval time frame, that we're looking for the Philosopher's Stone, and then we're looking for the elixir of life. And then what does our mainstream tell us? Well, we already have these capabilities. We can already turn any material into gold. We just don't do so because it's not cost effective. We're still looking to give you that eternal life thing, and we're going to keep promising that, but nothing ever seems to come from it. That's a good one, John. Yeah, no doubt about it. Oh, yeah, there's a couple who've claimed it, and maybe so. Or maybe all of us have. Yeah, exactly, Heidi, exactly. So... oh, yeah. Yoga, katas, internal Far Eastern methodology. And it's funny to me how all the truth seems to be scattered across all of our different cultures and societies all across the land. Beyond any shadow of a doubt. But then you also see some of the other symbolism behind it. You can get the idea of creation, being able to create different life forms, and that's a little bit more of the darker side to it that we'll get to in a moment. And that's always something that got to me about alchemy. And you can see these are supposedly images from a successful attempt at creating the Philosopher's Stone. That's what some of these images are actually from, representing that. And then you even get the concept of the different sorts of life forms that they were able to create. Now, just think about this. If this was a baseline knowledge from earlier civilizations, then what were they really able to achieve with this? What did it really show? What were their capabilities? Because we have all these creatures, to include Pegasus, the winged horse, the griffin, and the chimera that we'll look at, that could well have been created by alchemy. Well, and it could just simply be the hardship, the quest itself, the experience. That's another way to look at it. Oh yeah, and the blimmies too. So there's many different ways that you have to look at it, and you have to seek it out, whether it is an actual material or whether it's an internal struggle. So many different ways to look at it. This is an interesting image that I always found that comes from the alchemical concept, which shows the eternal life coming from the sun. And indeed, this supposedly brought down a lot of sun worshippers, although you see there's a little bit more of the symbolism here within this particular image, with the different, the birds, the swans, and then the way the light's coming down and how it's regenerating life. We even have what looks to be interesting structures in the back here. A lot of interesting artwork, though, that's affiliated with alchemy. And then it should also be noted that it's very well documented by all the major civilizations, whether it was Islam or Latin or what have you, the Roman Empire, if that really existed as we were taught, or, it's just something else. It's intriguing to think of, though, that alchemy supposedly had its roots all the way back in the very origin of civilization. So for us, we might think of that as the first era. So a lot of different aspects to it and a lot of different ways to look at it. Yes, you're right, Quantum Paradox. And where do you think those solar logos came from? Why do you think that concept is viewed as one of the baselines of the whole concept of sun worship? Now, I get accused of everything from my logo, from being a member of the Masons to being a sun worshiper, and I can assure you neither is true. Like I said, the sun that I have was merely a gift from my students as they drew it up because their favorite lesson was on Lucius Aurelian and the religion of Sol Invictus. So there you're hearing it from me. That's where it all came from. But always interesting, though, that these were the depictions that they give us of alchemy. So why do you think it would be that they want us to only think that alchemy is just something that was just a lot of crazy sorcerers or charlatans, because that's the term it got associated with in the medieval time frame, and there's no reality to it. Why do you think that they would push that aspect so hard? That it didn't really exist, it was just a bunch of charlatans who were practicing things that they shouldn't have practiced. Well, and people will come after you for every different way. I mean, my logo could be something as simple as just saying LA. What are you, some sort of supporter of Los Angeles? It's just funny to me. But you got to be able to laugh about things. You're absolutely right, Quantum Paradox. Because when people are misled, when they believe something, then they're going to follow something. They're going to think it's the absolute truth. Yes. Ridiculing them and finding every way, shape, and form to do so. And that happens all the time. And it's always funny to me the amount of effort that goes into it. Now, the image we're looking at here is the very representation of the Philosopher's Stone, or the magnum opus that the alchemists looked for. But I think it's something that we need to make sure that we understand. Sorry, Rebecca. I just had to laugh about that one. So good to see you, Jedi. Glad you could join us. Yeah, I know, Scotty. I know. I spend too much time worshiping the sun. But, I think there is something to be said, though, about the natural environment and actually being re-energized by our natural environment. Now, I don't think it's just the sun. I think it's everything. You find strength in everything. Not just the sun, but the rain, the clouds, the land, your horse, your dog, your parrot, whatever animal that you have. Oh, that's a good one, Chassis. Why don't you start that in the comments, and you can start a whole nother conspiracy theory about that on the channel. Get it? Okay. Anyway, back on topic. But the whole magnum opus was what they were looking for and what they were trying to achieve. Now, this is supposedly an image that represented achieving the Philosopher's Stone. It's represented here in the breastplate on this image. Now, this was from a series of art plates that supposedly came from the time when there were a couple alchemists in the medieval time frame that achieved the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of life. And it was represented by this interesting multicolored breastplate right here. Yeah, not sure what to make of it. And for all we know, maybe it's just something that they passed down to us, so we could be ridiculed. We're going to tell them to laugh at this breastplate. Yes, this is the Philosopher's Stone. This is the elixir of life. Joke's on you. I mean, what do you think? Does that all add up, or could there be some truth to it? Oh, yes. It comes up quite a bit, as does many other symbols of alchemy. Yeah. The armor itself is rather suspect. And that's kind of what they're trying to show. They're trying to show a little bit of a visual appearance to it. Oh, yeah. And we get a lot of those esoteric helmets, don't we, Sky Sage? Not exactly what you'd think of as the traditional medieval or Middle Ages helmet. Yeah. Did Saint Germain exist? Or, if you go back and you watch, what was her name? Elizabeth Clare Prophet on In Search of, he just incarnated as all these different people. He was Merlin. He wasn't Napoleon. I'm trying to remember who he was in the Revolutionary War. He told them all to sign that thing. Oh, yeah. And it is very ornate armor, and that's what it all comes down to. Depicting and giving the concept of the Philosopher's Stone. But is the great work internal or external? Or is it both? Well, if you look at the baseline and all the documents, you get the impression it's both. You have to achieve internal balance before you can express external balance. And if you think about that, that actually explains a lot of what we see with the great achievements of architecture in the past from the previous civilizations. They had achieved internal balance, and therefore they were capable of doing many great feats. So, some very interesting and intricate imagery, though, that is conveyed with alchemy, as you can see right here. There's many different interpretations you can make of these symbols, and yet at the same time, these are all symbols that we've seen before in many other places. And it's probably one of the most beautiful aspects of researching alchemy is just some of the symbolism and artwork that you see in it. Are you seeing wars? Are you seeing rebirth? Here you have the concept of the king and queen, king of the sun, queen of the moon, and the depictions of both of them. So again, what it represents is a world in balance, and that was ultimately the main focus of alchemy. A world in balance, or as they say in Far Eastern philosophy, yin-yang. Aha, yes, precisely. Hey, Crypto Alchemist. I was hoping you were going to make this one. Yeah, the peacock comes up a lot too, doesn't it? It's another one of those symbols that we see. Red dragon versus white dragon. Yep. Do the colors have a meaning? Not really sure. Yes, isn't it? Isn't that an interesting observation? Very true. Yes, we are. And doesn't it seem like there's so many things that seem to work to pull us out of balance? Or, as Lancelot said in Excalibur, your rage has unbalanced you. Interesting line, isn't it? So many wonderful things in that movie, Excalibur, 1981. I will never not recommend it. Oh, yeah. Well, and so does the Space Force, too, so make of that what you will. What is the sphere? Yeah, let's take a close look at that. Isn't that interesting? Almost a broken sphere. You know what? I don't know. I'll have to do a little bit more research on this and see if I can ascertain what they're saying that actually is. I mean, we can come to our own interpretations. I'm always fascinated by the very brilliant architecture, though. This is supposedly an image from the 1400s, but who knows for sure. And here they're actually showing the mining, as though we've actually got little elves here that are mining for it. I mean, what kind of outfits are they wearing? But, it's just a representation. Here you got more of a yellow golden sun, showing the long search for the materials to create the material for the Philosopher's Stone, supposedly. And then always the flask, always the jar, always the beaker, whatever terms we want to call it. It's always depicted very prominently. And what exactly is it meaning? What's it telling us? Thanks, Corey. Appreciate that. It's all good. It's all good. Oh, yeah. And I think that's what it's trying to tell us, and that's what they're trying to show us as well. But, the other thing... Oh, hold on, J-Dubs. We're getting homunculuses. Don't worry. Search your inner self. Yes, indeed. And that seems to be what everything is derived to take us away from. Focus only on what you see, not what you feel. Ah, yes. Very true. And then, of course, we end with this particular depiction of the sun. And yet here we see a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of gold. It'd be interesting to see a red sun in the sky. Have there been times when anybody's seen a red sun? Yeah, I'm going back to that exploration we did earlier. But what's the significance behind the red sun? And is there ever a time that you could see a red sun? Don't know. Not sure. We've already talked about a couple different alchemists since you were asking about it, but... exactly. And I have too. And the time I can remember was during one of those times when they said we had a lot of wildfires and there was a lot of ash and soot in the air. And that appeared to be the red sun. Red sun is also prominently featured in Superman, especially the 1978 movie, where they very specifically refer to a red sun and a yellow sun. Jor-El says yellow sun, General Zod says yellow sun. So, precisely. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to because oftentimes we take a lot of things for granted. Oh, yes. Different colorations of the moon, too. And so, what's that have to do with alchemy? Alchemy reflects the entire process of life. It reflects the entire aspect of everything that we're searching for, starting internally and then externally. Yeah, I think this might be Prague. What do you think? Or it could have been any old world city, as they all looked like that at one point in time. Yes, and then I wanted to show unobtainium, even though I wasn't the greatest fan of this movie that this was from, but unobtainium being that material that can do anything. That's kind of a way to look at the Philosopher's Stone. It is unobtainium. It is the material that can do anything. Indeed. Sacred geometry. Good observation there. And I think in a lot of ways it is. But unobtainium is how they try to represent it in the modern context. It's how they try to show it in movies. It's what they want to show the Philosopher's Stone is. So, yes, very true. And it's kind of funny how they still continue to keep people obsessed with the concept of gold. I mean, maybe you saw that recent movie that came out of Australia that was called Gold, that had kind of an interesting post-apocalyptic theme to it, and then it just became a survival flick when two guys found a big nugget of gold in the middle of the desert, and then one had to stay and the other had to go to find an excavator, and then the one that stayed just slowly eroded over time. So, oh, the pineal gland. Yes, we're gonna have to watch The Beyond again, aren't we? Good movie there. Jeffrey Combs, Barbara Crampton from the 80s. Naturally, what other decade would it be from, right? Yeah, I think one of these explorations, Rebecca, I'm going to have to do a Red Mercury exploration. That's definitely one topic I'm going to have to tackle at one point. Oh, yeah. Very, very true. Okay, so let's get to some historical examples of alchemists. So there are numerous historical examples of alchemists, and some of the well-known ones were right around that time of the Library of Alexandria, although they'll say it's a couple hundred years before or after, but they say it's in that general time frame. Who knows for sure? And you can find many different examples. And of course, we don't want to overlook the fact that we're told in the official historical account that Islam and the developed intellectual capacity of Islam and their recordings kept alchemy going. Although what I find interesting is that alchemy is in all the major cultures. It transcends all the boundaries. So in a manner of speaking, this philosophy, this proto-science, is more evidence, just like all the buildings that we see all across the land that have the same architectural stylings, that we have this philosophy that's all across the land that shows us that this came from a previous civilization that was everywhere. Now, maybe I'm going too far with that. That's just a theory. But I find it awfully odd that we have this concept of alchemy, and it's very similar, whether you're in China, whether you're in Turkey, or whether you're in France, depending on the time frame, that they're all looking for the same things. Philosopher's Stone, internal enlightenment, and then the further back you go in researching, you'll see that's exactly what they were saying. There were also several prominent women alchemists that were forgotten over history, and that seems to be a recurring theme as well, especially when we go back to the Library of Alexandria. So who knows exactly what was going on? You know, do we have different aspects that are forgotten? The mainstream history tries to explain this by saying that this was just falsely attributed writings. Yes, of course they would say that. There was really no person named Cleopatra of Egypt. It was just a pseudonym for many different authors, and they just wanted to hide who they really were as they kept these documents recorded. Now, what makes more sense? Was there this esoteric form of thought that just happened to rise up all across the land and just happened to share these baseline themes of looking for the Philosopher's Stone or the elixir of life? Or were they simply trying to keep alive a philosophy that they had inherited or they had retained from the previous civilization? What do you think? And when you look at these examples of these historical philosophers or these historical alchemists, what makes more sense? Exactly. And that's kind of what they try to say when they talk about how alchemy evolved into modern science. And they even have the temerity to tell us that alchemy contributed to modern science. And that's why they don't call alchemy pseudoscience. They call it proto-science, believe it or not, as disturbing as it may seem. Exactly. Many approaches and yet the same baseline themes. And the one that's forgotten, it's a search for internal truth. It's a search for internal spiritual strength. Well, maybe they developed a lot of other things. I mean, if they really had that capability, what would be the limit on any of it? Oh, look at you, Jamie, bringing in a protoculture. Robotech, Jamie, Robotech. I knew you were going to factor that in there somewhere, weren't you? Yeah, that's what we're told, but we know that's a load of hooey there, Sky Sage. We're always told that. And it's funny because, you know, initially they support that mentality, then they deride it, and they support it again. But, you know, as we've covered in our other explorations, they're always going back and forth. So you're not really supposed to know exactly what to make of it, but I don't think there was any evil aspect of it at all. So, oh, that's a good way to put it there. And you're probably right. And, you know, it's probably the ongoing boss as you go throughout the whole time. Hey, Sooner West, thanks for joining us. So, you know, historical examples. And even our aforementioned Catherine de Medici was supposedly a studier of alchemy or a student of alchemy and even considered a master, depending on what sources you look at. So, yep, Anna Green Gables, when she was Catherine Medici. Sorry, I'm a big Megan Follows fan. I'm just going to admit it. But one of the things they never showed in Reign was some of the other esoteric pursuits that Catherine Medici had. And if Catherine Medici was a historical figure in any way, shape, or form and had the amount of influence that we did, or that she did, then it would probably make a lot of sense that she was very well versed in the original studies of alchemy. And maybe there's something more to it than that. Maybe as we go into the Fifth Era, which the Medicis were probably an early powerful family of the Fifth Era, they had more knowledge. Now, did they use it for good or bad or for their own self-betterment? Well, that's a discussion we can have some other time. But it seems safe to say that certain individuals were very well read into alchemical processes, and Catherine Medici was no exception. So I just wanted to highlight her. Now we go into the next aspect of alchemy as we go past historical examples. And we talk about how it was replaced by modern science. And I think the whole reason being is that they had retained a lot of the knowledge. And the whole point of on isolating and attacking certain groups is because then you keep the unity from being whole again. That's always the mentality behind it. I mean, what was the central theme in the movie Kroll? It was to keep the two of them separated. One of them couldn't do it together. They had to be together. They had to work together. It was the two of them together. That's what it was all about. And it's never ended. Yeah, everybody's still under attack. It's a way of dividing and conquering. And so that's why they don't want people to see it this way. Exactly. And so what they wanted you to believe, and what they still want you to believe to this day, and this was one of the researchers that I said, or one of the elements of research that I looked at that really got me to going into alternative research, because I knew it couldn't be true. And that came down to how modern science supposedly replaced alchemy. Because they tell us that modern chemistry, modern biology, and even modern medicine is derived from alchemy. Now, how true do you think those statements are? Ah, yes. Yeah, and it could be. Or are all those esoteric thought processes just another way to confuse it? Or is there truth in them? You know, those are things that we can argue all day under the sun. There's many different examples with them, so. Aha! And there's a lot of people that'll look in the number 3. Is number 3 bad? Is it good? Or is it both? A lot of times, everything is both. And I think alchemy is one of the fundamental examples of being both. It can be used for good, it can be used for evil, and it can be used for indifference. Another example of alchemy in the more modern period is the example of Doctor Strange. Now, of course, I'm going to use Doctor Strange from the 1978 TV series because you can still watch it for free on YouTube. I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the modern incarnation of it. I guess it's okay. But you go back and you get to see Peter Hooton playing Doctor Strange. Actually had some interesting costumes, and there's a lot of interesting symbols in this. And you get to see Jessica Walter in her prime. She's the one who does the voice of Mallory Archer in the series Archer, but she's wonderful in this. She plays Morgana. I'm trying to remember what her character's name was. Or Morgan Le Fay. I think it was Morgan Le Fay, the antagonist. Wonderful, wonderful show, though. And a lot of great symbolism within it. And it really gave you the idea of what actual alchemists were like. And when you realize what it's all about, it's not about who has the power. It's about who actually has the knowledge and who has stronger spiritual strength and internal spiritual strength. But great TV series from the late 1970s, Doctor Strange. Highly recommend it. Yes, it is a product of its time. Yes, some of the movies has that disco feel to it, but it's very intriguing and very interesting. And again, it reflects how alchemy is viewed in modern way, shape, and form. Oh, yeah. Why am I not surprised, Quantum Paradox? And there was something about that series that seemed a little bit more true to what Doctor Strange was really representing, because you could even compare and contrast what Doctor Strange was in the 1970s to what Doctor Strange became in the 2010s, much like many other things. So, yeah, beyond any shadow of a doubt. But that's how they tried to replace it, and now really the layouts for classic alchemy became the layouts for modern science, and you can see why it looks familiar. Why you've seen it, whether you're looking at an old painting from medieval times or you're watching an episode of Mr. Wizard, you see the same things. So quite intriguing. And now we go into the darker aspect of alchemy and the theories of application. What if this was misused in some form of technology? And that's always something we have to consider. Ah, yes, he certainly did, didn't he? Well, look at that there, PJCC West. And that's one of the hardest things for all of us, to stay righteous in action, but not be vengeful. Chimeras, yes, you're leading ahead there, Jamie. But there is a darker side to it. There is a way that this can twist humanity, and not just on the outside in the physical presence, but on the inside as well. And there are many examples of how alchemy can be used for darker arts or to achieve terrifying purposes. And that's why it continues to this day. So again, it comes down to light, dark, good, evil, however you want to phrase it. Now, oftentimes we phrase things to justify things, but the reality is it's achieving a balance. And that's what we tend to forget in a lot of the symbols. Okay, so back on to the whole theory aspect of it. And what was alchemy really throughout its development within the 5 eras? If we see alchemy as a base of knowledge, a science, or not a science, but a base of knowledge that came all the way back from the foundation eras, maybe even from the first era, when, in the first era is not something that's easy to talk about or explore. I'm going to get to it. But if the origin of it is in the first era, then what's happened over time is, like everything else, we slowly lost capability. And why did we lose longevity, creativity, inspiration, and self-reliance? Because we began to question the baseline aspects of what alchemy really presented us. And that was self-balance, self-understanding, self-awareness. As a result, we began to lose our sense of self and our capabilities diminished. And yet what kept us going was our promise for a return to those capabilities that we had in the earlier eras. And if alchemy represents that, and there's a lot of evidence that indicates that it does, especially if we see how alchemy itself has been subverted to being our modern science in the 5th era, then we can see that there was a time when alchemy offered so much more. What if the real explanation behind our ability to build these buildings in the distant past, in the previous eras, came from having the knowledge of alchemy? We achieved self-balance, and as a result of that, we had unbelievable knowledge, the ability to achieve things that now we consider logistically impossible, the ability to create materials that seem to defy explanation to us to this day. I mean, compare bricks from what we define as the 5th era to the 4th era. Drop them off the top of a bridge and see what happens. You'll get a really good example in that respect. Oh, yeah. And it should be noted that the baseline of alchemy supposedly came from Islam when they retained it. So, yeah, I agree with you, Rebecca, and it seems like everything is done to distract us. So, I know, Jamie. Well, I had to connect it in some way, shape, or form, didn't I? And again, it's all just theories, but to me, it all seems to add up pretty well. It seems to explain why we have this diminishment of capability, why we are slowly being grinded down, losing our creativity and our ingenuity and our self-reliance. We have to rely on somebody else. Now, I'm not saying self-reliance means that you forget other people and you don't help other people. But what I'm saying is that your first priority in life is you have to be able to take care of yourself. In order to help other people, you have to be able to help yourself. And I think that's something that we forget. A lot of things turn us away from that. And now we go into the darker aspects of what alchemy could represent, because one of the beliefs that I have, or theories, one of the main reasons why our civilization declined so much and why we had such terrifying events that occurred in the reset time frames or right before the reset, is because of how alchemy was corrupted to making creatures such as these, the chimera, the actual hybrid. Now, do we have examples of hybrids that we try to create today? Yeah, exactly. So we're told, is it, or is there another substance beyond gold that just looks like gold? Maybe that's what it represents. Very true. Hey, Tara, good to see you. And then there's other theories. Now I'm going to get a little dark here, so just bear with me. So this chimera can be a very fearsome creature. Imagine if this really existed in some time frame. It exists a lot in myth, and there's many examples of the chimera. And by the way, it's not just Greek myth. You can also find it in Chinese myth, or Chinese history and Greek history, however you want to call it, or actually all of our history. But it becomes a very terrifying creature. You also find representations of creating a chimera in the corruption or subversion of alchemy. Many different sorts of creatures. And so perhaps there's something more to the concept of the dragon, the chimera. Maybe they all did really exist. And there's many examples of it. And when you look at all the imagery and what sorts of animals and creatures that they represented, perhaps these were created through alchemical processes or a subversion of alchemical processes. Even the griffin that we see everywhere. If the griffin was created through alchemical processes, was this viewed as a more noble creature? Did this represent something that society wanted to create? And it represented the civilization at the height of its capability. This was considered a noble creature that was created with noble intentions. A real example of humanity following the image of a divine creator. Now I know I'm going into blasphemous territory here, but just stay with me for a moment. Because what if that's what this really represents? Why do we see the griffin so much, and what is the griffin? What does it really represent? Why is it such a powerful image when we talk about the concept of Tartaria or the Fourth Era civilization? What does it really mean? Oh yeah. And there is a lot to it. There's a lot to it that seems like a regal animal. And we see it everywhere. We see it in many buildings and the mix of that building. For example, I was throwing in a really bad reference there to E. Townsend Mix, but so many buildings that E. Townsend Mix did. Well, we did, but I don't think they had flags in the Fourth Era. I think they just put it on their buildings. Who needs a flag when you can put an actual griffin on your building? So, flags are something that we know about in the Fifth Era civilization. But why would you bother with a flag? I mean, even the old Roman legions, they didn't use flags. They used aquila. I would say that's a little bit better than a flag, but that's just me. That's just my opinion. So make of it what you will. But in any event, so the noble regal animal, the griffin, made by alchemical processes. And you'll find the griffin everywhere. Everywhere. It's not just in one nation. It is all over the place. You got one example here in Iran. You can find the one in Rochester, Minnesota in the Plummer Building. You can find it in numerous other buildings all over the place. You can find it in Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Africa, all over the place. The griffin appears everywhere. And yet the mainstream tries to tell us the origin of the griffin myth as suggested by Adrian Mayer. Yeah, give me a break. Yes. Because they looked at skulls back then and said, hey, I think that's a griffin. And then everybody just followed along with it? No, I don't agree with that one bit. Because you see it everywhere. And it does come across as a very regal animal, and there's also many interpretations of it. Now, why would there be many interpretations of it unless there were different dimensions of it or different types? Because they were making it through a process of alchemy. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, more terms I can't use. Just like Lemuria, don't say that. There goes this video. Oh, yeah. And I'm about to really go in the dark part of this, so be prepared. Exactly. Different types of snakes, different types of every type of animal, different types of horses, different types of humans. Is one better than the other, or is it just because there's variation? And see, that's always the thing. We're always so obsessed with what's better than the other thing, what philosophy is better, what person is better, what animal is better, when we forget that we're all part of the original design. But that's what it all comes down to. Now, here's the example of the myth. So, here you've got multiple creatures created by alchemical processes. Perhaps the winged horses were something that was created by the more approved, more balanced alchemical process, and then the chimera by something that was going more towards the dark side of the arts. And we look at other images of the chimera, and we can see that as though someone decided to corrupt the processes of alchemy, and this is what they ended up with. And now we really go into the darker aspects of it, and those do exist. Now, if you're so inclined, I'm not going to show it in this little exploration, but if you're so inclined, you can look up the dark symbolism of alchemy, and it'll really take you down a very dark path. Much worse than if you look up things such as the worst threshold of hell or anything like that. It gets to be some very intense images, and I'll give you a couple examples. All right, the homunculus. I did explore the homunculus several months ago. I think it was back in the summer, where they created basically a counterfeit human being, if you will. Now, sometimes they're little creatures, sometimes they're full-sized. They're not genuine human beings, though. They're counterfeit. That was the real prospect behind the homunculus. And supposedly, there you go, Sky Sage. Supposedly, that was from corrupted alchemy and the whole aspect and concept of it. And it's actually a lot more common than we realize. It's just one of those things that we're not supposed to talk about. Oh, yeah. Should have seen what happened when I tried to do an exploration on that one, Saxon Ranger. Yeah, that wasn't pretty. And then maybe it factors into how the land was repopulated. We don't know. Oh, yeah, the golem. Yeah, another way to put it. That was another term for it as well. Oh, yeah, actually, I have, Sooner West, and I think it's an interesting theory. It's also funny when you mention that emojis were supposedly invented in the early 1980s, too. A lot of people aren't aware of that. I certainly wasn't, so. Oh, yeah. And I'm going to be doing an exploration here pretty soon on the Human Z. That will be an interesting one, because there is a lot of reality to that, and the mainstream also verifies it, so. But yeah, back to the homunculus, and then if you want another example of how bad alchemy can get, or the darker side of it, look at no further than the Mygo, the concept of the dark creature from Lovecraft, or Lovecraftian lore. And the Mygo was stated to have been created by alchemical processes, and it was an intelligent, insidious creature that used alchemical processes. Alchemical processes to terrify human beings, to do terrible things to them, and even make off with their brains. So, yeah, if you've ever read it, the Mygo are supposedly a creation of the dark side of alchemy, and they represented the worst aspects of it. And then their practices even represented the worst aspects of it. Now, there was a TV show from the late 1980s called War of the Worlds. I've covered it before. It's a pretty good TV show. And there was an episode called To Heal the Leper. You can watch it for free on YouTube. War of the Worlds, 1989, To Heal the Leper. And there's a lot of symbolism within that story that actually harkens back to alchemy. Now, we're told that these are aliens, but if you really think about it, do the aliens really come from across the stars, or do they come from some other dimension and some other existence? And of course, the plot of this particular episode, To Heal the Leper, War of the Worlds, revolves around one of the members of the advocacy, because the aliens operate in threes, surprise, surprise, and the three leaders, one of them is sick. And so then they have to take him off to try to heal them, and they end up using alchemical processes to heal this sick, quote-unquote alien, or creature, or whatever you want to call it, Mygo. And it's an early appearance by actor Kim Coates, the guy who played Tig in Sons of Anarchy. It's really funny seeing, or interesting to see him in his early years, because he's a Canadian actor. The show was produced in Canada. So strongly recommend it. Heal a Leper, War of the Worlds. You get to see everything in that one episode. Alchemy, concept of alien or body parasites. Yeah, exactly. Whatever you want to call them. All depicted there, and all quite interesting. And then this comes down to the very darkest aspects of it. This is actually considered alchemical art, where you see the final and total erosion of the human being, inside and outside. And like I said, this can get very dark, so I'm not going to dwell on this because I'm not trying to freak anybody out, but this is probably the worst aspects of it. And believe me, you can find much darker representations and much more terrifying representations if you look at the worst aspects, or maybe I should say the most terrifying aspects of Lovecraftian lore. It all comes from the subversion of alchemy. Okay, that's enough of those images. All right, so the last thing I wanted to show, one of the structures that I looked at in my explorations, and maybe you don't remember it, was the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa. Now, why am I going back to the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa? Because it's right down the road from my building number 1, the Iowa State Capitol. But it's a very interesting structure because I believe that there is something. If you go to these structures in person, if you go to the Iowa State Capitol and then you go to the Polk County Courthouse, you'll get a completely different feel, a completely different intuition. And why is that? I long suspected that the Polk County Courthouse, which is what we're looking at right now, was originally a structure from the Fourth Era that was subverted in some way. In other words, it represented alchemy. Now, I may have told you, you can take video footage, you can take photographs in the Iowa State Capitol. You cannot take photographs or video footage in the Polk County Courthouse. So I had to find these images myself. What you will never see in the Polk County Courthouse, though, are these banisters. And what you have are these very frightening, and you can barely see it here. I'm trying to zoom in as much as I can, but I'm trying to prove this to you. These very frightening ram's heads that are basically, they're almost skulls. They're actually ram heads, but they appear as skulls that are on the end of these stairs. And there's a very, very disruptive and disturbing energy feeling when you go in this building, especially right after you go in the Iowa State Capitol. So if you're in Des Moines, Iowa, and you get the opportunity, you can go into the Polk County Courthouse. You just can't take any pictures. I strongly advise or recommend that you do it if you can get to Des Moines. Go to both buildings, do it on the same day. And trust your intuition and trust what it tells you, because it's really a way to figure out that there's a lot more going on. Yeah, right. You know darn well what would happen if I took some footage and I tried posting it on the channel. I think you know what would happen to any of you, so. Yeah, they look like goat heads, and you won't find any pictures of them, but I can assure you they're there. Yeah, I think Jamie says it really nicely. I think the Polk County Courthouse was originally an old world building, and then somehow, some way they subverted it. If you go in there and you really look at the floor, you'll see a lot of the symbols that we just looked at. So, yeah. And do you think that's a coincidence or not? Well, Heidi, they may have been built the same, but I have no doubt that some have been twisted. And you might recall that Plummer building in Rochester, Minnesota. That one has some really strange feelings to it. So, yeah, exactly. And when you go there, Pete, that's exactly what it looks like too. So I get the feeling that this particular structure had something to do with whatever happened right after the last reset. There's some really dark vibes associated with it. So, yeah. And I'm not wondering if that's some sort of transfer or transition that's occurred to many of the courthouses, because we like to look at courthouses. They're great old world buildings, but something about them has been changed. Ah, yes. Reverse the polarity, as the third doctor like to say. Good old John Pertwee. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that's what you can really feel. And if you go to those buildings on the same day, you can get that different aspect, that complete polarization, that change in feeling. And it's all intuition, I'll admit it. But if you can see how they've been changed, that's a great way to ascertain and determine it. So, well, thanks. I appreciate that. Thanks for joining us. It's okay. It's going to be up one way or the other, I promise you. And I think that's what it represents, Sky Sage. And you can get that feeling in some of the old world buildings. Some of them you feel re-energized, reinvigorated. They've retained what they were originally built for. Now, two that I can think of that are in the Midwest area, the Iowa State Capitol. And if you go down to Union Station in St. Louis, that retains some really wonderful old world positive vibes. But then if you want to see the other end of it, go to one of the courthouses and see what kind of feeling you have being in there. Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly, Chassis. And I know it affects some people more than others. I can certainly tell you that it affects me in quite a negative connotation. You know, I mean, like I could loiter in the Iowa State Capitol for hours and just feel wonderful. And, you know, I'm in a county courthouse for about 5 to 10 minutes and I just can't wait to get out of there. Even with old world architecture. And I think you all know how much I enjoy old world architecture. So, yeah, that could be too. And maybe the designs have been changed. We just don't know. So, a lot of different aspects to it. Yeah, and you're probably onto something there, Pete. You know, they have a different intention or a different purpose. They've been repurposed, the ones that haven't been torn down. But some of them don't feel that way. And I think that's all tied together through the knowledge base of alchemy. And I think in summation, what we can come up with this exploration in alchemy, it is a base of knowledge. It starts with balance within the self, and then it can lead to actual knowledge application. It can lead to what it promises. It can lead to eternal life, and it can lead to the ability to achieve wonders in the physical existence. Yeah, I felt the same way on that one, Heidi. So, but in any event, that's pretty much all I have, or all I had set for alchemy. What were your thoughts on this exploration? I mean, I could certainly do an exploration on dark alchemy, but oh boy, I don't know if I could handle that for a whole hour, just because it takes quite a toll on everybody. Oh, make a your top 10 old world arch video. Okay. No, I doubt it. Not the ones that we would think of from the Fourth Era civilization. I think remnants of it are still around and used, but well, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I will admit I was a little concerned going into this one because it's not an easy topic to discuss or to try to make interesting in many ways, but I think it's essential for understanding how a lot of things tie together. Oh, there you go again, Jamie. Well, and it also comes up in the Final Fantasy series quite a bit, the whole concept of alchemy, too. I think in just about every one of them. Well, at least until 2000, because like everything else. Well, thanks. I appreciate it. Well, and you know what? You can be as much of an alchemist as you want to be, and maybe you could be a really good one. And watch out, you might have Elizabeth Clara Prophet saying, I knew him, and he incarnated as. Oh, well, I appreciate that. Okay. Well, here's a quick question I have for everybody. Thanks, Crypto. Alchemy of the Ancients. Yeah, and I think that's the real baseline alchemy that we want to get back to, or at least try to. So, well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's working, too. It almost wasn't working. That would have been bad. Okay. Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. Full Metal Alchemist. Yeah, I like that. All right, so here's what we're looking at for explorations. I found a little bit more that we can go back into the Civil War, because there seems to be a lot of interest in that. I was also going to look at unidentified aerial phenomenon and unidentified submerged objects. I know that's a new topic for me. And then I was also looking at the 1960s. So anyway, I'll get that up on the poll and see what you all think. Okay. Well, and in any event, some of these are more difficult topics, but I think that the 60s would go along well with the 1980s because a lot of what happened in the 80s was set in the 60s, interestingly enough. So, yeah, that's part of it too. Well, it's funny you say that, Quantum, because it's kind of the same problem I run into when trying to say Atlantis and Lemuria now. You follow me? So much for this live stream. Sometimes you just have to enjoy this. So, well, and one of the most interesting 30-minute TV programs came out in the 1960s. So I think you might enjoy that if you haven't heard of it. So, oh yeah, yeah, that came up quite a bit, didn't it? All right, well, we'll get up the poll and you vote for your favorite one. So, well, I appreciate everyone being here and thank you for contributing. And, as always, you make it very enjoyable and you help me to improve my understanding of these topics. So we shall continue. Oh, thanks, Sooner West. I appreciate that. Thank you, Quantum Paradox. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I mean, I know I like to do the greetings and everything, but I'm trying to stay focused and I want to make sure I talk about the important aspects of these topics and then not take too much time because, we don't like to be controlled by time, but on the same token, brevity is the soul of wit. So I'm kind of walking the fine line there. That's how I achieve my balance. So make of it what you will. Imagine an assembly line of human beings or artificial human beings being put together piece by piece. Imagine all the characteristic aspects, all the idiosyncrasies, whether it's a mask, earphones, or virtual reality. Also imagine some sort of artificial human being grown in a jar. Yet this artificial human being has extraordinary capabilities. Perhaps abilities that change its physical form with elongated skulls. And yet also the terror of our nightmares. A horrifying creature that you can never escape. These are all the aspects that we're going to be exploring today. We're also going to look at the most disturbing element, which is the concept of clones and total control from a central node. All of these various aspects represent the homunculus, supposedly a creature created by the process of alchemy in the distant past. The homunculus had tremendous capabilities, and we're going to look and examine as to how the homunculus could have threatened civilizations in the past and even brought about their downfall. We'll also look to answer what is a homunculus, and consider if homunculuses are still with us, or should I say homunculi, which is the plural form of homunculus. We're going to examine it through the show Robin of Sherwood, a TV series from 1984 to 1986, which was the quintessential version of the Robin Hood legend. It's considered such because it was the most imaginative version, because it amalgamated historical events with myth, fantasy, and legend. It even incorporated magic and processes of alchemy. It also incorporated every aspect of the Robin Hood legend, considering the two conflicting origin stories, as there were two different characters who portrayed Robin Hood, or took up the mantle of the hooded man in the series. By examining that series, we'll see a plot element that concerned the use of a homunculus to potentially bring about the downfall of the civilization depicted in Robin of Sherwood. So let's begin by exploring what a homunculus is. And it has been covered by other alternative research channels, such as Mind Unveiled, and they've done a great job on it. A homunculus is a representation of a small human being. Consider what you see in this image. Originally depicted as small statues made out of clay, and this is where you also see the depictions of what are considered golems. The term lends its name to the cortical homunculus, so it's still used in modern medical terminology. The fully grown homunculus was supposedly greatly skilled. What exactly was it greatly skilled at? Why would it be so beneficial? In art, and can create giants, dwarves, and other marvels. So consider an artificial creature grown in a tube of some sort. Yet an artificial creature with tremendous capabilities once it was fully grown. Have we seen homunculi in the past? When we look at the biodiversity that we've seen in what we're told are fantasy images, we question what's their actual origin. Was this just the imagination of the individuals at the time? Supposedly a time when imaginations were suppressed. Yet the concept of a homunculus is also considered nightmare fuel, a terrifying small creature when initially birthed, and then growing into a fully grown being with tremendous powers and capabilities. It is something that, from our natural perspective, would seem very threatening. Yet these creatures have always been with us in many shapes and forms. And as has been pointed out on other alternative research channels, such as Mind Unveiled, there are many different incarnations of homunculi. And oftentimes they are used either as some sort of pillar of society or something that tears society down. I'll even take the example of Dune, of the Axidol tanks, where they would grow Gola clones in the bodies of what used to be women that were converted into creatures that simply reproduced artificial creatures, or clones. So the concept of the homunculus exists everywhere. It's in our legend, it's in our science fiction, and it's still used in our medical terminology today. But why is it so enduring? We consider the fact that oftentimes we fear, naturally, the counterfeit human being. The concept of cloning has supposedly been with us for many decades, and it's even been possible, allegedly, to clone animals. So if it's possible to clone animals, why is it not possible to clone human beings? What threat could a homunculus really represent, though, to a civilization? What possibilities could such a creature, if it did once exist, and if it still exists, could it provide? Whether it's to forces of darkness or forces of control, or could it even have a beneficial result? In the legend Dune, the concept of a homunculus, or a modified human being, was able to conduct space navigation. Now, whatever we believe in the terms of existence of space, we have to consider the fact that if a homunculus exists, or homunculi have existed, they've provided tremendous benefits, and yet they also provide an amazing threat. We look at the example of the show Robin of Sherwood, 1984 to 1986, aired on the British Broadcasting Corporation. An incredible show that mixed historical events with fantasy, myth, and legend, and it considered the concept of Robin as the hooded man. Robin in this series was brought about by Herne the Hunter, a mythological forest spirit that constantly harnessed the forces of light and darkness, and always said this. Herne the Hunter existed during a time of great injustice, which was brought about by the existing government and the Norman conquest of Great Britain at that time. Herne the Hunter would provide a special set of weapons and a consideration for what he would call Herne's son. The series was notable for its depictions of the Sheriff of Nottingham and Guy of Gisborne, who were characters who struggled in their society, and at the same time they were constantly willing to engage in acts of evil simply to serve their society, and yet it oftentimes were at odds with each other. It also concerned the aspect of magic and sorcery, and indeed the pilot episode is called Robin and the Sorcerer. The sorcerer here being Simon de Belmay, who is a satanic worshipper, and is the first major opponent that Robin of Sherwood, actually starts out Robin of Locksley, the first Robin Hood, encounters in his initial adventure. And he has to overcome the sorcery and magical capabilities that Simon de Belmay has at his command. It's also stated in the story that Simon de Belmay was on a crusade, and during the crusade he lost his faith in the righteous God and turned to satanic worship. There's a lot of interesting dialogue, and the show doesn't come forth as good and evil. It's a lot of gray area aspects, including appearances by the Knights Templar, who are depicted as having beneficial pursuits, but then at the same time they seem to have been corrupted by a form of evil. It's an intriguing series, and it even accurately depicts the evil that's found in the clergy or the bureaucracy of the church at the time, represented by the Sheriff of Nottingham's brother, Abbot Hugo, who delivers one of the most memorable lines, "May the peace of God go with you, take no prisoners." It even depicts King Richard as someone who is not to be trusted, and ultimately merely a warlord who is seeking to further his own power and his own aims, played wonderfully by John Rhys-Davies, and is quite memorable in the series. There is also other adversaries they encounter, such as the Hounds of Lucifer. The Hounds of Lucifer are a satanic cult looking to bring about the return of Lucifer, led by Morgan of Razafar. In this story, Morgan manages to infiltrate and take over an abbey and poses as a nun, and their followers pose as actual members of the clergy. However, they reveal their true colors, and they're simply trying to collect the swords of Wayland to bring about the return of Satan, and nearly succeed. This is just one of the many examples of the unique plots in Robin of Sherwood. Towards the end of the series, or the second series, the original Robin, Robin of Locksley, dies in a final standoff against the forces of Nottingham and the sheriff, when Prince John, who succeeds King Richard, demands that the efforts of Robin Hood and the band of outlaws are stopped using any means necessary. He's succeeded by Robert of Huntington, played here by Jason Connery, who takes up the mantle of the Hooded Man, bestowed upon him by Herne the Hunter. It's intriguing because Robert of Huntington comes from a noble family, and we see the two different origin stories for Robin Hood. Prince John, played wonderfully by Phil Davis, is an insane megalomaniac ruler, and is oftentimes shown with bouts of insanity and ruthlessness. Finally, the most terrifying enemy that Robin of Sherwood faces is Golnar. Golnar is a warlock and a sorcerer, and his machinations include many aspects of sorcery and alchemy. He's assisted by Grendel, and both of them originally served a noble called Owen of Clun that Robin Hood had to overcome to rescue Maid Marian from in the third series. They begin a revolution called the Time of the Wolf, where they're looking to overthrow civilization by using magic, and Guy of Gisborne even joins their little band, dressed up as wolves. They even try to recruit the sheriff, but he's not having it, and he resists their efforts to recruit them. It's quite a consideration when we look at how this civilization, which is shown to be corrupt, and the government is shown to be corrupt, still has its aspects to survive, and the fact that Golnar is looking to do anything to overthrow the civilization. They manage to capture Robin Hood and the band, and Golnar decides to utilize an incarnation of a homunculus, or a version of it, also called a golem. And his intention behind this, using the process of alchemy, is to create a creature that can actually approach Herne the Hunter, the forest spirit, who is really the guide and benefactor of Robin of Sherwood, in order to kill or destroy Herne the Hunter, and bring about a time of apocalypse, or the time of the wolf. And in fact, this is the final two-part episode of the entire series. It's interesting because it depicts Golnar utilizing the processes of alchemy, and he manages to create a golem or a homunculus, a duplicate, a doppelganger of Robin of Sherwood, or Robert of Huntington as his original name was. And the intention being is that this monster can bring about the time of the wolf, in which case it's an apocalyptic time and it will tear down the civilization. One thing the show has to be given credit for is the fact that everything is depicted in a gray area. Oftentimes you find yourself cheering for the Sheriff of Nottingham and Guy of Gisborne, even though you know that they're evil characters. And we see the full effect of this homunculus or this golem that Golnar, the sorcerer, creates. And it's a terrifying monster with exceptional strength. And we think as to how it reminds us of what capabilities a homunculus could truly have, and why it could really threaten a civilization or society. Because if you think about what's depicted in the plot of this episode of Robin of Sherwood, we see that the homunculus or the golem or the doppelganger turns against its own master, killing Golnar. It has only one intention, which is to kill and destroy and bring about its own power. And it seems as though Golnar almost accepts this. And Golnar is played by the exceptional actor Richard O'Brien, who we saw in Dark City. Eventually, the homunculus, or golem, encounters Herne the Hunter and very nearly kills the forest spirit in a beautiful scene of standing stones. And we see what the real intention behind it was. Fortunately, Robert of Huntington, or Robin of Sherwood, is able to encounter his doppelganger and defeat it in single combat using the powers of light and darkness. However, this plot may reflect things that we've seen in the past. The use of a homunculus in order to bring about the downfall of a civilization. It's something we don't often consider, and yet we have many examples of it in our legends, in our myth, and in science fiction. This was the last episode of Robin of Sherwood, and unfortunately they couldn't get the show produced anymore. And there were other incarnations of Robin Hood, although I think it's safe to say that Robin of Sherwood was the best incarnation. We look back at our depictions of a golden age of previous civilizations, and oftentimes people ridicule this because they are quick to believe that they are living in the greatest times, even though constantly the media reminds us every day of all the terrors and horrifying dangers that we face, yet conversely people are willing to believe that they're living in the golden age. For those of us who tend to look a little deeper and ask more questions, it becomes more clear to us, though, that the true golden age must have been in the past. The reason being is that we can see the evidence for it, and while many of us are conditioned not to look at that evidence, we question how a previous civilization could have fallen. I believe that one of the depictions of how a previous civilization could have fallen was with the use of the golem, or the homunculus, in the past. Consider that there was some sort of dark power that was looking to overthrow previous civilizations, and we'll just go all the way back to the Second Era, one of the early civilizations in the Golden Age, as this channel posits on its grand theories. Consider the fact that you have incredible human beings that are able to work together, no one feeling any sort of concept of superiority over anyone else, people able to pursue their own individual goals while at the same time existing in balance with the society. And how would one go about undermining such a beautiful society that was able to achieve stunning things? And the simple answer for that would be to create a homunculus, or homunculi, the plural form of homunculus. Fraudulent, fake, or artificial human beings who espouse human characteristics and are able to infiltrate the society and bring about its downfall by infiltrating the great pillars of the society, whether it was its government, its elements of culture, or in every element that you can think of. Government institutions, culture, art, entertainment even. Everything was up for grabs and was attacked by the artificial human beings, or the homunculi. Now this might seem like a very extravagant theory, yet at the same time we have far too many mentions of homunculus or homunculi in our legends, and even in the actual accounts that we have that survive of alchemy. Now, can we trust these accounts? Maybe, maybe not. It's up to us to try to discern what exactly is fact and what's fiction, and it could well be that this is just simply a legend. Yet there are many subtle references to it, in many different aspects of our current society and our entertainment. And as I often say, our current society does reflect the old world, because from the old world, the elements of it still exist, and you can see it everywhere. Therefore, the homunculus very likely existed in some fashion, and we still talk about it today, if you consider the prospect of cloning and what that could potentially offer, and what it could also threaten. Consider the fact that the homunculus existed in the past, and that it was used. It could have had a benign purpose, but like everything else with the use of evil intentions, its true design was to bring about the downfall of previous civilizations, to keep human beings in a state of misery. Considering what we looked at with the previous civilization, which on this channel we call Tartaria, or the Fourth Era, how it went through three distinct phases: its inception and rise, its ascendancy and its height, and its decline and fall. And very likely we see the fact, and we theorize the fact, that this previous civilization was destroyed by infiltration of the society. And if you think about it, the use of a homunculus or homunculi in vast quantities could have been very threatening to a society. And I believe one of our best theories for how the previous civilization fell was through that infiltration. Now, could there have been a variance on how this truly happened? This initial physical battle that was won by the previous civilization, or Tartaria, and then the subsequent battle that was lost. It could have been that instead of a physical homunculus, perhaps there was some sort of spiritual homunculus, if you will. As you encounter many people who are very narrow-minded and don't seem to consider other possibilities. And it's as though they're simply following a program, a recursion loop. Almost as though human beings don't seem to be true human beings. They seem to be spiritually aloof, and they have no internal strength. And they're happy to castigate other human beings who actually try to search themselves and actually try to improve themselves, because they don't ever want to see a civilization that preceded ours again. They want to see something that's in total decline, and they want to see something that continues as a civilization that questions itself, that doubts itself, and we know full well that happened in the past. It must have, because we know the civilizations that preceded ours did fall. Now, the mainstream admits there were great civilizations before ours that fell, but they'll tell us that they were inherently corrupt civilizations, and that modern man, over the last 200 years, has achieved incredible things, and continues to achieve incredible things, even though no one seems to concern themselves with the fact that we can't replicate the achievements of the past. Even if you believe in space, we can't seem to even go to the moon, although we're working on it very hard, supposedly. We look at the images, though, of destruction of the past, and whatever version of history you believe in, you can't deny the fact that civilization has always been keen on destroying itself. It always seems as though we're told that these are nationalistic ideals, or these are conflicts for conflicting methods of politics or existence or economic systems, or even the rights of human beings. Although it's quite fascinating when we consider the fact that it just depends who you are, and then suddenly it becomes okay to violate the rights of human beings just so long as your intentions are good. I believe the second that happens is when we see a repeat of what's happened in the past. And oftentimes another theme that you'll see in both fiction and history is that what's happened in the past will happen in the future. Or as I like to say, history repeats itself. History does not have to repeat itself. If we're aware, and if we retain our own conscious awareness of what's happened in the past and what could happen in the future, we can achieve a better tomorrow. We can achieve the golden age again. Because if it weren't possible, then people wouldn't be wasting their time, and that's exactly what they'd be doing and what they are doing, to try to deter us from continuing these explorations, in order to find and believe in a better tomorrow. It is possible to achieve the golden age again. It is possible to achieve the wonders that we had in the past, and even exceed them. And it all starts with simple belief. And a lot of times people are detracted from their belief. They don't believe that we can build wonderful edifices again. Or they'll simply accept the explanations that we're given that, well, we don't have the money, we don't have the artisans, we simply don't have the capability. And enough of these absurd theories, as someone like Carl Sagan would tell us, in things such as homunculi or the homunculus. Yet those physical realities still exist. And the idea of those physical realities exist in our current society. And it's even still a medical term. You'll be told it's a coincidence. Well, there's a lot of coincidences everywhere that you see. Yet when we look at the glories of the past, and many of these buildings still exist, the great state capitals, many of the great Art Deco buildings, and even the buildings that preceded them, and people will simply dismiss them. We look at what we have available to us now, and we can see that our current society is a demoralization society, a society that's not designed to encourage us, but one that's designed to bring us down. Don't fall victim to demoralization. Look within yourself, believe in what you know is right, don't be afraid to pursue the truth, and don't be afraid to pursue your dreams. Yes, people always try to stop you, but nobody can really stop you. All they have are words, and words are empty. When you look around, remember that there are still monuments to the past that exist. Visit them. They're all over. You can even go to a courthouse in your local county and you can see the beauty in it. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like